My name's Alex, I'm 29, and this is the story of how one wrong turn in Albuquerque turned my world upside down. I'd planned a solo road trip, something to clear my mind after a brutal breakup. I needed the open road, the kind of endless horizon that makes you feel both insignificant and somehow hopeful again. I'm the kind of person who likes things planned, routes mapped, stops scheduled. But that day, I felt different. I wanted something spontaneous, something a little more adventurous, so I took a detour. I wish I hadn't. The map app said the road was a shortcut, a lesser-known route through the desert, and it seemed harmless at first. No cars, no signs of civilization, just sand, sky, and freedom. It wasn't long before I saw her, a hitchhiker, standing on the shoulder, her thumb out, hair whipping around in the wind. Normally, I wouldn't even think about picking someone up. But there was something about her. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was the loneliness I could see mirrored in her expression. Her name was Rachel, or so she said. She told me her car had broken down a few miles back, and she needed a ride to the nearest town. At first, everything seemed normal enough. She was chatty, a bit scattered, but nothing too alarming. She talked about her family, her love for old movies, but there was an edge to her, a jittery energy that made me uneasy. As the miles rolled on, she kept glancing back, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, muttering something about being followed. I tried to laugh it off, tell her it was probably just the desert playing tricks on her. After all, we hadn't seen another car for ages. But then, I saw it too. A pair of headlights in the distance, flickering in and out of view like a ghost. "It's them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I didn't ask who them was, but her fear was palpable, and it started to seep into me too. The car kept its distance, but it never disappeared. It was there, a dark shape on the horizon, keeping pace with us no matter how fast I drove or how many turns I took. The tension in the car was suffocating, Rachel growing more frantic by the mile, her hands fidgeting, her eyes wide with panic. When we finally saw a gas station, I pulled in, hoping to put some distance between us and whatever was following. Rachel stayed in the car while I went inside to pay. That's when it happened. A man burst through the door, his eyes wild, his voice raised as he pointed at me. "Where is she?" he shouted. He claimed Rachel was his partner, said I'd kidnapped her. I tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. The gas station clerk stepped in, demanding everyone calm down, and for a moment, I thought it was going to be okay. But when I turned back to the car, Rachel was gone. Just gone. The police weren't much help. They took my statement, asked me a million questions I didn't have answers to. I told them about Rachel, about the man, about the car that had been following us. One of the officers exchanged a look with his partner, then told me Rachel wasn't who she seemed. She was wanted for a string of robberies, and the man chasing us wasn't her partner. He was one of her victims, trying to track her down. My stomach dropped. Everything she'd said, every nervous glance, every story she'd told me, it was all a lie. I'd been played. A few days later, I got a text. No number, just a message. "Meet me. I can explain everything." Against my better judgment, I went. I needed answers, closure, something to make sense of it all. The address led me to an old abandoned lot, the kind of place where bad things happen. Rachel was there, looking just as frazzled as before. She tried to convince me she wasn't a bad person, that she was running from people who wanted to hurt her. But before she could finish, the man from the gas station appeared. He had a gun, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with rage. It was chaos. Rachel shouting, the man demanding answers, and me, caught in the middle, realizing just how far out of my depth I was. I don't remember much of what happened next, just flashes. Rachel lunging at him, the gun going off, the sound of my heartbeat drowning everything else out. I ran. I don't know how, but I managed to get to my car and drive, the tires kicking up dust as I sped away, leaving them both behind. I never heard from Rachel again. The police found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just an empty lot and a lot of questions. I think about her sometimes, about how easily I let myself get caught up in her story, how I wanted to believe her. I guess that's the danger of kindness. of wanting to help someone without really knowing who they are. One wrong turn in Albuquerque, and I almost didn't make it back. So if you're ever out there driving those empty roads and you see someone who looks like they need help, maybe think twice. Not everyone is who they say they are. Story 2. I've always prided myself on being able to sniff out a good deal, especially when traveling on a shoestring budget. My name's Jess, I'm 25, and I've been documenting my travels as a blogger for a few years now, hopping from country to country, always hunting for the best experiences without breaking the bank. Eastern Europe had been on my list for ages, and with my funds running low, I was eager for anything that seemed like a bargain. So when I found this hostel, one with glowing reviews and an unbelievably low price, it felt like a godsend. If I'd known what was coming, I never would have booked it. The hostel was supposed to be in a small town just outside of Krakow. The directions seemed simple enough, and I followed the map, the streets growing narrower and more deserted as I went. When I arrived at the supposed location, I found myself in front of a building that looked anything but welcoming. It was old, run down, with boarded-up windows and crumbling steps. There was no sign, no indication that it was a hostel, just silence, the kind that makes you feel like the world has forgotten this place exists. I tried the door, but it was locked, the handle cold and unyielding. Looking for something? A voice called from behind me. I turned to see a man standing a few paces away, his clothes worn, his face lined with age. He had the look of someone who'd seen too much. I explained about the hostel, showing him the listing on my phone. He nodded, almost sadly, and said, "That place shut down years ago, but I know somewhere else you can stay." Every instinct told me to walk away, but the sun was setting, and I had nowhere else to go. He led me through a maze of empty streets, past rows of darkened houses, until we arrived at another building. It wasn't much better than the first, poorly lit, the paint peeling from the walls, but it had a flicker of life. There were people inside, other travelers, or so it seemed. They were quiet, almost too quiet, their eyes downcast, avoiding me as I checked in. The man introduced me to a woman at the front desk, who handed me a key without a word. The room she led me to was sparse, just a bed and a small table, the walls bare and the window covered with a heavy curtain. It wasn't until I tried to lock the door that I realized something was off. There was no way to lock it from the inside, just a keyhole and no key. I stepped back into the hallway, looking for someone, anyone, to ask. The woman from the front desk appeared at the end of the corridor, her face partially hidden in the shadows. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice flat. I hesitated, then told her about the door. She smiled, a tight, forced smile. "It's for your safety," she said, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "You're better off staying in your room tonight." I should have left then, but I didn't. I went back to my room, the door clicking shut behind me, and sat on the bed, my heart pounding. There were noises, footsteps in the hall, whispers just beyond the door, and the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. I tried to sleep, but every creak, every distant sound, kept me on edge. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. I held my breath, waiting. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I opened the door a crack, and there he was. Another traveler, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave," he whispered, thrusting a crumpled note into my hand before disappearing down the hall. The note was simple, just a few words scribbled hastily. "Leave before sunrise." I didn't wait to find out what would happen if I stayed. I grabbed my bag and slipped out, the hallway empty, the building eerily silent. I made my way down the stairs, the air thick with the kind of dread that makes your skin crawl. As I reached the lobby, I saw them, the staff, the woman from the desk, and the man who'd brought me here. They were standing by the door, whispering to each other, their heads snapping up as they saw me. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked, their tone dripping with false sweetness. I didn't answer. I ran. I shoved the door open and bolted into the night, my feet pounding against the pavement as I heard them behind me, their voices rising in anger. The streets were a blur, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I finally saw lights, a diner, open 24 hours, a beacon in the dark. I stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. The staff there looked at me with concern, but I couldn't explain, couldn't find the words to describe what had just happened. It was later, after I'd calmed down, that I found out the truth. A local I spoke to at the diner told me that the building I'd stayed in wasn't a hostel at all. It was a front, a place used to lure in travelers, people like me who wouldn't be missed right away. A trafficking operation, he called it. His face grim. My blood ran cold. Everything clicked into place. The locked door, the quiet travelers, the warning to leave. I was lucky. I got out. But I still think about the others. The ones who stayed. The ones who didn't get that warning. Traveling on a budget can make you take risks you shouldn't. Trust people you don't know. I thought I was being smart, finding the best deal. But sometimes the cost is more than you can afford to pay. If you're ever out there, looking for a place to stay, remember, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Story 3. There's something about the mountains that makes you feel invincible. My name's Ryan. I'm 34, and I've always loved hiking, especially with my best friend, Dylan. We'd been through countless trails together, each trek pushing us further, making us feel more alive. This trip to Mount Rainier was supposed to be like all the others, just a weekend getaway, 2 friends, and the open wilderness. But this one changed everything between us, and not in a way I ever expected. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, crisp mountain air, the kind of scenery that makes all your problems seem small. We started early, following a well-marked trail, enjoying the view and each other's company. It was later in the afternoon as the sun started sinking low that Dylan spotted it. An old, weathered trail marker, barely visible under the moss and brush. It wasn't on the map and I wanted to keep going, stick to the plan. But Dylan, always the adventurous one, was intrigued. "Come on, Ryan," he urged, that familiar glint of excitement in his eyes. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The trail led us deeper into the forest, away from the familiar paths and into a part of the mountain that felt untouched. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon it, an abandoned campsite. The tent was torn, faded by the elements, and the belongings scattered around were covered in dirt and leaves. It was eerie, like whoever had been here left in a hurry and never came back. Dylan found a journal, half buried under a pile of rocks. The pages were damp, the writing smudged, but we could still make out some of it. The entries were short, frantic, talking about hearing whispers and something in the woods. It sent a chill down my spine, but Dylan was fascinated. That night, Dylan couldn't stop talking about the journal. He was obsessed, flipping through the pages, trying to piece together the story of whoever had left it behind. He kept saying he wanted to find out what happened, that we couldn't just ignore it. I tried to reason with him, remind him that we had a plan, that we were supposed to stick to the main trail, but he wouldn't listen. He was fixated, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something else, something I didn't recognize. The next day, things took a turn. The weather changed fast, the clear skies replaced by thick, dark clouds. The wind picked up, and before we knew it, we were caught in a storm. The rain came down in sheets, the temperature dropping as the wind howled through the trees. We got separated. I lost sight of Dylan, the rain blurring everything, the sound of thunder drowning out my shouts. I found a small overhang, enough to keep me dry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There were noises, branches snapping, low whispers carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the storm, just my mind playing tricks, but it felt too real. When the storm finally let up, I went looking for Dylan. I found him near an unmarked cave, his clothes soaked, his face pale. He was standing there, staring at the entrance, his eyes wide with something like fear. When he saw me, he didn't say a word, just shook his head. his hands trembling as he gestured for us to leave. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I asked him what he'd seen, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept repeating it. "We need to go." We made it back down the mountain, but something had changed. Dylan was quiet, withdrawn, his usual smile gone. He refused to talk about what had happened, about the cave, about the journal. I tried to bring it up once, but he shut me down, his eyes dark, his voice harsh in a way I'd never heard before. A few weeks later, he stopped answering my calls, cut off contact completely. It was like he'd disappeared, just like the person who'd written those entries. I did some digging after that, trying to make sense of it all. I found out that the journal belonged to someone who'd gone missing years ago, a hiker who'd vanished without a trace on Mount Rainier. There was no resolution, no answers, just another name on a long list of people who'd never come back from the mountain. I still think about it, about Dylan, about the cave, about the whispers in the woods, and the way curiosity can lead you places you were never meant to go. Mountains have a way of humbling you, reminding you that you're just a small part of something much bigger, something that doesn't care if you make it out or not. I lost my best friend on that mountain, not in body, but in spirit. And I've learned that some trails are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved. Story 4. My name's Liam, I'm 28, and I was on my way to a family wedding when everything went sideways. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, drive through a few states, catch up with some family, and take my mind off work. But somewhere near the outskirts of New Mexico, I made a wrong turn. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. A quaint little detour into a quiet town, the kind of place that looks like it's been frozen in time. Little did I know, this detour would turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The town didn't have a name on any of the signs, just a small diner and a few old houses that lined the street. It looked picturesque in an eerie sort of way, and as I pulled up to the diner, I figured I'd grab a cup of coffee and some directions back to the highway. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the diner went silent. The few people scattered at the tables barely glanced at me, their eyes flicking away almost immediately. The waitress at the counter gave me a tight smile, her eyes never quite meeting mine as I asked her how to get back on track. Her directions were vague at best, her answers short and mumbled. It was like she wanted me out of there, and fast. As I walked back to my car, I noticed someone sitting on the curb nearby, a disheveled traveler, his clothes dusty, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked at me, his gaze intense, and muttered something as I passed. "You need to leave. They won't let you go if you stay." I turned to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he was gone, slipping around the corner of a building, vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just some drifter, someone who'd had a little too much to drink. I got into my car, ready to leave, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then fell silent. I tried again, but it was no use. That's when the mechanic showed up, an older man with a greasy jumpsuit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered to take a look, said it was probably something simple. I watched as he fiddled under the hood, his movements slow, deliberate, too deliberate. He glanced at me now and then, his expression unreadable. After a while, he straightened up and shook his head. "Looks like you'll be stuck here a bit longer," he said, almost like he was amused. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, a growing unease settling in my stomach. I decided to take a walk, find someone else who could help. The town was empty, the streets eerily quiet, the windows of the houses dark. I found a general store, its door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside it was dim, the shelves half stocked with dusty goods. And then I saw them, photos, pinned to a bulletin board near the counter. Photos of cars, travelers, people who looked as confused as I felt. And there, among them, was a picture of my car, taken just hours earlier as I'd pulled into town. Panic set in. I needed to leave. Now. I ran back to my car, my heart pounding, and started working on the engine myself. I'm no mechanic, but I knew enough to figure out what he'd done. A wire deliberately disconnected. Something easy to fix if you knew where to look. I reconnected it, the engine roaring to life, just as I heard voices behind me. The mechanic and a few others were coming out of the diner, their expressions no longer friendly, their intentions clear. I slammed the door shut, shifted into gear, and floored it. The tires screeched as I tore out of the parking lot, the figures behind me breaking into a run. In the rearview mirror, I saw them piling into trucks, their headlights flicking on as they began to follow. The road was a blur, the town vanishing behind me as I sped down the narrow streets, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the lights growing smaller in the distance. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway, the sight of other cars finally making me feel like I was safe. I pulled over at a rest stop, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I called the police, told them everything, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. Just another traveler with a wild story, they said. No evidence, no proof, just my word against whatever that town was hiding. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. A few articles online, buried deep in forums and travel blogs, stories of a town that extorted travelers, trapping them until they paid to leave, or worse. There was never enough evidence, never anyone willing to go back and face them again. I was lucky. I got out, but I still think about that traveler, the one who warned me. I wonder if he ever made it out, or if he's still there, stuck in that place that the world seems to have forgotten. Sometimes, a wrong turn is just that. A mistake, something you laugh about later. But sometimes, it's more. Sometimes, it's a reminder that not every place is safe, that not every smile can be trusted. And if you ever find yourself on an empty road, in a town that doesn't feel quite right, trust your instincts. Because I learned the hard way that not every town wants you to leave.